Alright, now we're live. Hopefully. It's always a gamble. Alright, so this one Levi filed a while ago, and I think we could not convince ourselves what to do with that. Yeah, I think these are the only two things that are. Jesus, this was 2018. This is not bad.
3 months. It's fine.
Actually, that's a good point.
No, it's 2018. It's terrible.
Well, it's once the year is different. You're like, oh my god, how long ago?
We just flush everything that's from 2018. So, for context, string.copy right now is guaranteed to give you back a brand new instance of the string so that you can mutate it effectively. But mutating string instances is going to run afoul of a bunch of optimizations that we want to do in the 3x, 4x, whatever time frame. Which means that if you're calling this method and mutating the string instance, you are almost certainly going to run into problems once those new optimizations come online. So the idea is, if we obsolete this method now, we could start weaning people off of it and onto things that are more supportive for their scenarios.
Right. So what would that be, by the way?
What would what be?
What would the replacement be for this scenario?
So if you're doing pinvoke, there are APIs on the Marshall class that will give you back mutable buffers that you can pass into the pinvoke layer. If you're calling this because you intended to call string.clone, you can call string.clone or not because it doesn't do anything. If you want to mutate a string, if you want to duplicate a string and mutate like one very particular value in it, you can use any of the factories on string that give you back the span before the string itself is baked. You can then go touch the span, change the very particular element you want, and then return back to the caller, and so on. So there are options, depending on your exact scenario.
Seems like the particular message on this needs to be something short and then a link to the longer explanation.
Yeah, I was about to say, we should probably add an FW link at the end or something, and then we can point to whatever we want to point it to, right?
Yeah, because I almost would have expected this message to say string builder rather than give links to like Marshall or tool.
Yeah. To be honest, I kind of saw this going to an FW link or something like that. I think the reason that people use this and then use unsafe code to mutate things in place is that they don't want to go through the indirection of a string builder, because that is the more intuitive option, right?
Right, but we have the span create thing. So they could say they want the thing equal to the same length and pass in the input string and then clone it and modify the features in that factory.
Yeah, that's probably the more straightforward one, right? Alright, so then I think I have no problems with that. Like I spent some time thinking about obsolete in general. I think these kind of issues where you have a single API is fine. And we have nothing else right now to do it in a baked fashion, so I'm inclined to take it as is. Any concerns with obsoleting that everywhere else? No.
What do you mean everywhere else?
So I don't want to just do it in core. Like if I obsolete the method, I will obsolete it in the standard and then by extension by everybody.
Oh yeah, well that's why it's canon for standard.
Yeah.
Did we ever get the response from? Doesn't look like we did from Andy on if you can downgrade an obsolete error or ignore it.
Let's say the answer is no or yes. How does it change your assessment for this issue?
So if it's warning, you can do pragma warning, ignore
Right.
Kato or whatever you put there, and
one of them lets
error you can't.
Yeah, one of them lets users work around it if they're, say, on a framework that does support mutating strings, or they're not quite ready to make the big switch. The other one makes it so that users upgrading have to make the change. I don't think there's a big difference, and I think users should be changing it to just work and not mutate. But it's that question of like how hard is the hurdle once you do try and upgrade.
Yeah, so I mean, right now nobody suggests. I mean, like there's a suggestion maybe we should make it an error eventually, but right now we would not make it an error anyway. So like, I mean, I would never introduce an obsolete as error unless the API absolutely doesn't work at all ever. In which case that seems fine. But I mean, this API works, right? So it's just, yeah, you shouldn't do it. In which case, I think a warning is fine in general. And then maybe in a 4.0, we just yank it out. But I would not hold my breath on that one. We rarely have done these things.
Emo, sorry, I got caught up in an interview and I had to come late. Was the question answered about when we choose to use obsolete versus the analyzer tooling?
Yeah, so basically what I said earlier is that I don't have a problem with making individual APIs like this obsolete because the analyzer would basically do the same thing, right? The big difference between the analyzer and this approach is that the analyzer will give you the option to so let's say there's a feature you want to obsolete, and the feature is spanning multiple different methods or types or properties, right? Then you can basically obsolete them all, and without putting attributes on every single one of them, and then you have a single ID that you can suppress. So the problem with obsolete once you ban like 12 APIs is that you get pinged for every single one of these 12 APIs multiplied by all call sites. And that means you can, at that point, only disable obsolete entirely for your project or pragma suppress all call sites, which is super annoying. And with Analyzer, you can just suppress the one ID for this particular feature that was obsoleted. In this case, though, given that the feature and the API is one in one, it would basically be the exact same thing. Sure, if you use this API like in hundreds of places, the Analyzer would still be better because you can just suppress it globally for this one ID. Versus in this case, you still have to suppress it for all call sites. But I think this API here is not very likely to be used by, across a wide variety of call sites, right? So I think it's fine. The biggest problem with the analyzer approach right now is that it's not baked in the sense that you have to install it, right? Like it's not referenced by default. We haven't productized it yet. So we should do it because it keeps coming up. But I think the problem is that neither us nor the language team is actually actively investing in this, and so obsolete is the only thing that is completely built in, and we just mark it, and then everybody else gets the warnings. Does that make sense, Steven?
It does. It raises I think this is the first time in all of these API review meetings that we're obsoleting something.
Yep.
So it does raise the question of, this sort of opens the door to our being open to it.
So I think in general, like I'm open to it so long, it's not a disaster, right? So like, and there's another API. I think we never reviewed the obsolete, but I think we ended up doing it. This was the, what is it? WebSocket application targeting for 5, right? Which was clearly an infrastructure API that was never meant to be public. And like those kind of instances, I think obsolete is completely fine because you just, it's one API, it's probably never used. You just make it explicit that you should never use it and you move on. I think for everything that is a feature, it's much more complicated. And I mean, I think Barry was pretty hardcore about let's ban everything that could potentially be insecure. But the problem is that you can't really pinpoint it, right? It's like there's plenty of features like binary formatter where, well, if you were to obsolete it, how would you even do it? Would you just ban binary formatter? Would you say certain API patterns are only problematic, and then at that point you're kind of like really into the analyzer territory because you really want to give this feature an ID at that point. Because if you use binary formatter a lot in your code base, like you don't want to disable all of obsolete at that point, right?
Right, and the argument with that too is there are safe ways to use it depending on the application.
Yes.
For instance, like you simply never cross a trust domain, whereas something like this, the very specific use case for this API is violating a CLR invariant.
Yeah. Yeah, it's basically a workaround, right? I think the other reason why you might use this API is because you, for some reason, ended up relying on reference equality in cases you don't want to do that. But like, it seems very constructive.
That's not going to work in the future anyway.
Well, if we were to do string inlining, yes.
Right, but I am seeing more of a push for that lately. And what I want to do is get the ecosystem at least into a state where we can do the experiment without breaking people too much, because we've primed people for these changes coming down the pike.
Yes. Yeah, Christian is just posting and says API port says 9.8%. I think the problem with the API port stat is that I don't have access to the call sites, right? I only see the aggregate results, but I'm pretty sure that most of the usage you see in API port is from either some library or some designer generated stuff that probably doesn't matter. Like I for example, I've used string.copy in MS Build to get to the string formatting thingies because you have to like what's it called, the transforms or whatever, because it's the only way you can actually invoke functions in MS Build. But it's not actually what you want. So I think in general, like it seems fine. All right. So is there any pushback on obsoleting it? Good. Let's just do this.
Presumably, making this obsolete will also entail fixing up the few usage we have of it across CoreFX, ASP.NET,
Yes.
etc.
Correct.
Yes. All right. So this was one where Jan pinged me on. I think Tanner pinged me on this as well. So this is effectively a type that we already have internally. I don't know whether we have the exact type, but we certainly have these methods internally.
So up until about 2 weeks ago, we had about 50 different methods that matched all of these signatures spread throughout CoreFX and CoreCLR total. And one of the community members went and created the internal BitOps class and centralized all of this as part of the larger request for that we previously reviewed and said we wanted more information on use cases. So he centralized them all. Now we have this exact class with these exact methods. And Jans basically said we should review this because these ones are actually shown to be highly used.
Right.
And it answers the issue of for hardware intrinsics, which expose most of these methods.
Right.
What do you do for the software generic implementation?
Right. So the idea is that this is also the place that we would put like CRC32, like anything that we would say callers can assume this API will always work, and we just take care of using hardware intrinsics to accelerate them, right?
Yeah.
I don't think CRC32 would go here. All the rest of these things are you're looking at a 32 or 64 value as the world, and you're it's rotate, shift.
Well,
shift
so
is easy to avoid.
CRC32, from the perspective of how the hardware intrinsic APIs are exposed, are essentially it takes a previous value and the next integer value, and it combines it and returns another integer. So it's essentially doing it on
Okay, so the CRC32 primitive, not the CRC32
Right.
stream. Okay.
right. The stream is built using the primitives, and potentially you would put the primitive here for lack of a better place.
All right. So then,
I think the only interesting one here is BitOps log 2. You would think that we should put it on math with the other log functions, but we can't because it's a breaking change.
right.
And in this case, it is basically a primitive BitOp for integer types.
So why is it a breaking change? Because it conflicts with another one?
Because the float in double overloads, integers implicitly cast to double today, and now they'd be implicitly going to int, and then implicitly casting back to double on the return value.
But they take UN and ULong, right?
Those
Here.
still implicitly convert to double, and then the result, which is a uint or integer, implicitly converts back to the double that the user is expecting. So it's a double whammy of breaking.
So I'm not understanding. So today, what do we have on math? We have
So today, if you call math.log and you pass in the literal 1,
yes.
it calls math.log double, where the 1 is casted to a double. If we add the uint or the int overload, then that 1 will instead be treated as uint, and it will return the unsigned integer result rather than the double result.
Really?
One's
Yep.
never uint.
Huh?
One ever uint?
It's implicitly convertible to uint.
Yeah,
Oh, the
that-
literal,
The literal one.
yeah, the literal 1 is implicitly convertible to uint before double.
That how C# works?
Yep, which is why we had to create the MathF class as well.
I mean,
literal set types.
it seems fine because this is indicating that this is giving a different log 2, like, because the other log 2 is giving, you know, if you give it a thing that's not a power of 2, it's going to give you back a non-integral solution. And
Right.
this is saying, like, you're getting an integral solution, so you better hope that you're asking the right question.
Well, so we also in 3.0 now have ilog in math, which is the integral log according to the IEEE spec for double and float.
I mean, so would it be better to just add?
I think this is the appropriate place, and I was just explicitly calling out that it's here and not on math because we can't put it on math, and it probably makes sense being here.
Well, so if we're adding this, sorry, whether or not we're adding this, because of the double conversion stuff already, would we also want to add ilog for the integral types as input so that it doesn't upconvert to double and back if you happen to give it an integral value? Because if ilog's giving the same solution as this would give, then
It gives the same solution for exactly representable integral values. So if you pass in like 1.0 as a double, it will give back the same result as integral 1. But if you pass in like 1.1, it will give the double integral
I'm
rounded.
asking, should we add the uint and ulong overloads to ilog so that your integer values don't get converted to double to get ilogs to get turned back into, and
No.
then they would just sideways call this?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Just because the ilog is a specific IEEE function.
Okay.
I mean, I think we could put log2 on math because basically the usage is non-existent. Like there's like, as far as I can see, nobody calls log2.
Well, that's because we just added it.
In 3.0?
Yeah, in 3.0.
Oh, then okay. Adding it right now would not be a breaking change.
Well, it will lead to confusion for users who are expecting it to work the same way as every other log function.
Yeah, I guess that, again, the fact that all the other logs are
Yeah.
returning the, like, this is 2 to the 2.073, whatever.
Yeah, I'm confused now. They're saying they're not just differing in type, they're also differing in behavior.
So the way that integral log returns the power of 2, the nearest power of 2, and trims off any fractional bits. That's what this does basically.
Oh, because it doesn't give a
Yeah,
floor.
so if you give it the number 5,
Right. Log2 would be some fractional radius.
log 2 is either 2 or 3, depending on which way it's going. So.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. That is fair. So I guess in that case,
Right.
Yeah,
What's the behavior for?
This log2 is basically find the most significant bit set and return that index.
What's the behavior for the rotate functions if bit offset exceeds
We
the size
match
of the thing?
we match the C#, what C# does, because we implicitly just use shifts under the cover, which is and the offset with 31 or 63 for long.
Does that do we reject negative values, or do we do the bit mask as if it's a unsigned?
We do exactly what C# does with regular
They
shifts.
and 31.
Yeah.
Which means that if it's a negative value, it ends up being like 32 minus that value. Or something like that.
yeah, what do people think about name and namespace type?
We don't normally use ops. Normally we use operations. And as in type names, we do prefer to extend them. I'm just thinking we had cryptographic operations, right, that went in for 3.0, 2.1.
I think bit operations is probably the better name. It's a bit verbose, especially for places where you're just wanting to do things like rotate left and such.
An alias.
And I know Emo and I talked a little bit offline about the namespace. I think basically there's two options here. There's system or system numerics. System makes sense in the fact that these are really primitive operations that just aren't exposed by the language for the most part, and they're fairly commonly used. But system is also not just a Dropbox for everything.
Right.
If it was system numerics, it would be the only type in system numerics that is not part of the external system numerics packet.
One argument for putting this in system is that we already have things like Bitconverter in there, things that already do manipulation of primitives. This seems like a sister class to that.
Yeah, but you also only have system for commonly used stuff, right? This is, I don't think, commonly used. I mean, it's
Well-
commonly used by people that do bit manipulation, which is a very small subset
I mean,
of people.
Okay, fair.
like, we'd have to be a little bit wiggly with the term converter, but should we just add these on bit converter?
Yeah, I looked at that. Bitconverter is super fucking busy though, and like Bitconverter is really also more about creating new values out of other values.
Yeah.
Yep.
Like this is really, I mean, if you squint,
That's why I said we
you're
have to be
producing a
bit-
double
bit
value out
handy.
of 2 bins, or whatever, but like it's not really what you
Yeah,
want.
it's Bitconverter is basically like a blessed reinterpret cast.
Yes. Yeah, I went to the same exercise as Jeremy. Like I tried to avoid getting a new type, but like I think there probably should be a new type because we will also probably grow that list over time.
Yeah, there's
Would be my guess.
the other proposal, which isn't these are ones that are actually being actively used, includes things like insert bit, extract bit,
Yeah.
complement bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not keen on system though. Like I have to say, like that's the only thing I'm. Like, I honestly,
Let's
I
take
think
a look.
numerics would be not bad.
Yeah, I think numerics would be an acceptable compromise, and it would be someplace that people might go to look for this type of stuff.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think if we went back and did it again, math would probably be better in numerics as well than system, for example.
So you mentioned earlier
Rotate
that
right's not really math.
yeah. You mentioned earlier that system numerics didn't have enough types in it to maybe justify this going into that namespace. What was that concern?
At least from what I've seen previously, we don't like having a namespace that contains a single type. And all the other types that are in system numerics are, like big integer and stuff, are not part of the standard package.
Got it.
I don't
But
think.
it looks like there's the system numerics namespace for net standard is split across net standard DLL and system numerics vectors.
Right, which is basically
So we've already split the namespace across the symbol vector.
right. It's basically things that are used by Corelib and things that are completely out of band.
I think it's fine to like if we're shoving it in Corelib because that's where we're going to use it. I think it's fine to be in system.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
numerics is growing with things like the tensor types, and there's requests for other types to be added, which would probably go in numerics as well.
System numerics bit operation.
See, I think honestly that seems right because there's also a vector of t thing is which kind of was the old version of hardware intrinsics without being hardware specific.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean this is similar in the sense that it's also not hardware specific; it's just hardware accelerated. So I think that kind of fits the. Steven, any objections to that? I take silence as agreement.
Just system numerics bit operations?
Yeah.
No, I like it.
This guy.
Someone in chat suggested bit primitives as an alternative name. Just throwing it out there.
Like how we have binary primitives.
Yeah.
Where's binary primitive?
System
Buffers?
buffers.
I don't think it makes sense in buffers
No.
though.
Yeah, it's under system.
I think it's a question of like where have we
Never heard of
which
this.
precedents use that primitives.
Yeah, I don't think we use the term.
The
that
primitives are mostly, it looks like what we have in there is that I want to read things and I know what Indianness the data is, and I don't necessarily know what Indianness the hardware is. Right, yeah.
Yeah. I think bit operations is a bit more self-explanatory what it is. Bit primitive seems a bit like you have to read a book.
Right, because bit primitives are read the bit and write the bit. Rotative bit vectors. not a primitive on a bit. Also, because then it would be in the system memory.
Yeah, Christian, you just answered that. Like basically, it's just we could, but it's not the term we want to use for this.
And binary primitives is part of the system memory package, and this
Yeah.
doesn't feel related to that.
Yeah, binary primitives also is, again, like a reinterpret cast. It's changing representation of data.
Right. So then let me just approve this guy.
Here's a question.
Is it for net standard 2.1? Was the question.
Yeah, like that's why I take that as API standard for the standard. But one of the things I think Jan was pushing for this because it's like we already see internal usage where we want to centralize this, and it sucks when it's in a library and you can't use it, right? And since we ref the standard right now, I might as well just put it there. It's not making anybody's life substantially harder.
So you're ready for review time.
Sorry, what?
Yeah, it sounds like what we should
You added
do.
approved didn't clear review.
Wait. You.
It sounds like what we need to do then as the engineering team is just like do a scrub through core CLR and core effects and see if maybe there are other patterns that it would make sense to bring onto that type.
Yeah, there's a few, but there were so like insert bit, write bit.
Oh, you had mentioned those earlier, yeah.
Those are also used. There was some discussion with Jan on whether or not those were considered simple enough to implement, just in line that it was worth exposing.
Sure.
I was of the side it is, especially since you can support those with intrinsics like BTS, BTR, and stuff. But it definitely required further discussion and thought.
Yeah. So what is...
All right, I'll just say yes.
Yeah, so that's for some context. So when we added the range type, so we needed this method get offset and length, right? Where basically you close the range over the size of the container, right? Because the range can have two indices that are open-ended, right? Where basically it says, oh, I start from, logical end -10 to logical end -2, right? You don't know the actual bounds at that point, right? And so this then basically gives you back the actual bounds. And the way we designed the API is we said, well, what you really want to do is you want to basically get two ins out, but like we looked at out and it looked ugly, and then we said, okay, what if we had to use a tuple? And then we said, oh, we don't want to use tuples for various reasons. And then we said, well, what if we just have a type that has a deconstruct method on it so that you can call the method and immediately deconstruct it into two variables, right? So you basically get kind of the best of both worlds. And since we just reviewed the other thing with the language team on like how do we name tuples, we also kind of talked a bit about versioning a bit more. And I think this is a clear example of something where, well, the API is called get offset in length. It will never ever return more than two values, right? So like in that sense, there's not really a concern regarding versioning. Like it's just two things. We will never ever add to it. And if we ever were to do anything with that where we want to return more values, you probably just create an overload. At that point, tuples are probably the thing you want to use. We basically also talked about naming, and we decided to go with the Pascal casing, right? So the way the API would look like would be like this, which I think makes more sense given where we are.
I mean, the only thing that I could think of is that we could decide that we wanted to use offset and length as exchange or as an input type on things.
Right.
And we can't once it's a tuple. But really, we have expanded memory for that. So.
Or just range, right? I mean, the whole point would be that range is the exchange type for ranges rather than offset and length, right? Offset and length is just the thing you would expect the receiver to convert to.
Why, Jeremy? Why couldn't we if it was a tuple?
Because what I wrote down for the proposal guidelines for tuples is never accept one as an input parameter. Not that we reviewed that yet, but Like, because as an input parameter, it makes more sense to remove the parentheses and just pass an offset and pass a length. Like, they're not really related. But in this
And
particular
the same thing
case,
can be set for the offset and length struct, right?
yeah, well, I mean, so then that was my statement for that one is, but it would be weird to sort of pass one of those because you would just pass a memory because it's clearly related to something at that point. And then Emo said, or you would just pass range. So I don't really see I can't think of a case where we would want to use the offset and length as a type in a method signature. Therefore, switching to tuples is fine.
Any more combination? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I haven't seen it. Steve, what are your thoughts on that? Your side.
No, I'm fine with it. I think it makes more sense to use a tuple now that we've agreed upon naming convention. I mean, we were basically going out of our way and making things more type intensive and more, instruction intensive and more CPU intensive just to avoid using a tuple. So
yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, so now that we've approved a thing and are going to put this in net standard, it's probably reasonable to resurrect the
naming
enumerable.zip.
Yeah,
I already talked about that with Emo. I need to revert the revert of the revert.
I'd like to see the Git commit message for this. This must be ridiculous.
There might have been one, two, or too many reverts in there, but you get the idea.
I feel like you said a number that was going to be taken out again. So
Yeah. Maybe it should be revert of the revert.
yes.
All right, so this is one where hopefully somebody else understands it because I'm not entirely sure I did. Did Jan respond to me? No, he did not. So for context, so we added these APIs, right? We added runtime feature is dynamic code compiled and runtime feature is dynamic code supported. And the intent of these APIs was to say, well, if you only care about the fact that you can generate code on the fly, then you only check for is dynamic code supported. However, there might be implementations of the runtime where the way this is achieved is by IL interpretation, which might be slow, right? So if you want to use CodeGen at runtime to speed things up, what you really want to check for is dynamic code compiled, which is basically, it implies it's supported, but it also means it's actually JITted at runtime rather than being just interpreted at runtime. And so for the idea, the two common scenarios are you want to do mocking where you don't really care about the performance, you just care about the fact that you need to generate a type at runtime that implements an interface, so you have no other choice but to use it. The only thing there you would care for is, do you have dynamic code at all? And then if you want to do things like regex where you want to use CodeGen to optimize, you would just use the other API. That was the intent. Now, Jan is pointing out that the way I understand his comments, I'm not entirely sure I do, but the way I understand it is that because these APIs are net new, you don't have a way to reliably detect an older version of the runtime where dynamic code is supported or it is compiled, but you don't have an API to query for that. So basically, if you use the dynamic LightUp APIs that we have, which is this runtime feature .is supported, and you pass in is dynamic code supported or is dynamic code compiled, in a runtime that doesn't know about those two values will just return false, right? Even though the answer is wrong because core CLR in .NET Core 2.0, 2.1, 2.2 clearly supports it and it's clearly compiled. But given that they don't know about these flags, they would return false. My opinion is that I don't think that's fundamentally bad. It just means that it's unfortunate because we didn't envision the APIs before, but I think the fix for that is you just do platform checks if you really insist on supporting .NET Core 2x, right? And then moving forward, you just use the new APIs. The way Jan proposes the fix is to say, well, maybe we should just invert the values so that when you write code, it looks like that. I'm not entirely sure I understand that reasoning, though, because to me, the current behavior is conservative, meaning if you're on a runtime that doesn't know about those things, the worst that can happen is you assume it doesn't have a feature, which seems better than the reverse, where you assume a feature is present because it doesn't know about the values.
Right. I was going to ask, what about other things that would have this API of the mono runtime, the Unity runtime, like having the notion of we don't know about this for this one, so it clearly is supported. Well, there may be places that your code can run that they don't support it and they don't understand the question.
So I'm
I
not
would-
sure I understand.
So I'm saying I disagree with Jan's proposal.
Okay.
I agree with being conservative.
So
Yeah.
you like his proposal B there, which is no API change and update the supported stuff to recognize the not prefix. So you can still write it logically
Right.
for people who want to do it that way.
So, like, let me just extend on this because it took me also a while to understand why you proposed that. So, basically, the idea is imagine you have another API like runtime feature dot is known, where you can basically ask, do you know about the value? And then you can interpret the false as, oh, you know about it, but you definitely know the answer is false, versus, oh, it's unknown because you actually don't know the value. The problem with another API is that the other API also doesn't exist. So, if you're running on a 2x runtime, you're still screwed. And so Jan's fix is, well, we just basically make it recognize the dash prefix, which doesn't require new APIs. However, I'm not entirely sure how this would solve the 2x problem, because you will still have to service it somehow to make it recognize the exclamation mark.
Well, so it would say false for this. So false, it's not compiled. So yes, it's compiled. But again, this would be a problem of saying that the API supports this, because on existing runtimes that don't know about this,
Right.
they would still interpret it. Going forward, it makes sense, but it does create a hole.
Right. Which to me is, I have to say, like, I'm not entirely sure.
So I sort of feel like the answer is
The thing that I don't understand from Jan's proposal is why can't the user just put the not in front of the runtime is supported call? Why does it have to be part of this?
So this is the light up scenario, right? So the is supported API exists forever since the type is exposed.
Right.
This property only exists in platforms that happen to have it.
Right.
So if you're targeting net standard 2.0, you can still call this thing here, passing in the string, and then when you're running on a runtime that would support this property, it would still return true, but you wouldn't be able to express it in a net standard 2.0 library.
Right, but so my question is, why does the not have to be part of the string? Why can't you put it?
he has a truth table.
In front of
Scroll
this
down a
is
little bit.
supported call,
Yeah.
because it's basically the wrong thing, right? So basically when you say is supported, right? So let's say the runtime doesn't know that string, it will return false.
Right, which means it will.
But that doesn't mean when you negate it that it's no supporting the feature, right? Or sorry, that it no means the code is interpreted, right? Because basically it's a tri-state, right? It's true, false, and I don't know the
Yeah.
key.
If you scroll down to like the first comment, there's the
Yeah.
truth table there.
So in particular, it's the 2.1 and older runtime. Both is dynamic and not is dynamic. Return false, because it doesn't understand the question.
Why can't we just have an is not supported?
Because that's
It's
a
a
new
new
API
API.
that you can't call on 2.1. I think is the argument. But I think that because we're introducing a new concept to an existing API, the existing runtimes don't understand it, which means you're now interpreting the not wrong on those, which means that we shouldn't change the semantic behavior, and we should add it in a new API. If you care about the older runtimes, you need to be
Yeah.
complicated.
I just understood how Jan's proposal fixes the 2x case, yes. Because the idea is that you don't have to touch 2x. 2x just will return false for both of those strings. And then the 3.0 runtime would effectively interpret the bang and give a more meaningful result, and that's how it's solved.
But that assumes that any future feature that we ever add, I mean, and maybe that is a thing that we will do, that we add it with true is the happy path, so that we never accept the the version A.
Yeah, I have to say, given that the only run, so like, the problem is, in my opinion, this goes back to the same discussion we just had with Anders on how to solve nullability, is that we are basically now signing up to support a bang for all runtimes moving forward, for all new keys. When in actuality, the only places we care about is the 2x runtime and these two strings, right? Which seems like a fairly heavy machinery for what amounts to be a point in time issue, right?
If all that we really care about is 2.1, just service it.
That, or just tell the person write a platform check.
Yeah.
The only problem with platform checks is that we went out of our way to make them impossible to write.
Right. But
So somebody has to write the code and how you would detect the 2.1 runtime reliably. But
right. But if
That
what we
might be
care
hard.
about is dynamic code compiled return true on .NET Core 2.1 and 2.2, that's a servicing bug.
yeah, the thing is, though, you can't rely on it. That's the problem with all bug fixes, right? Like, as in, like, well, if you happen to run on the service runtime, you get it. Otherwise, you're screwed.
Right. But again, it's if it returns false because you don't have the update, you hit your your other fallback. It'll still run.
That's basically my general argument with this feature here. Is that it's not that you're running into a crash. It just means your code doesn't run as efficient as it could have.
Yeah.
In which case, I think the behavior of the APIs is correct, as in, you like the worst that can happen is you fall back on something conservative. But I think the question then is, well, what do we do for all new values, right? I mean, the way the feature was expressed is that the outcome happens to be conservative, but that's more happenstance than actual design of these two properties. So the question is, when we add something else, well, you could run into similar problems.
So then what you actually want is like an is understood API.
Yeah, so what I proposed down here was something like that, where you would basically say this. You would say runtime feature is known, blah, runtime feature is known, blah. And then you say, well, when you have the APIs, then, okay, let's query them.
Yeah.
If you don't have them, well, then let's do some other crazy platform checks to try to deduce
Because we can't make this return a tri-state, can we? It would be a break and change.
like a question mark?
No, like an enum. Like I support it, I don't support it, I have no clue what you're talking about.
And the cool question mark.
Yeah.
I support it and I don't support it, and I have no idea what you're talking
Yeah,
about.
I was saying, if we were to do that, probably bool question mark would be better. But
Okay.
I honestly think, like, given how you write the code, I honestly think this is also not horrible, right? You just have some more duplication in your strings, but
Well,
fine.
we could, instead of adding a new is known API, add an overload of is supported that has a bool that says is known as well.
Then
if we-
Ansible.
Yeah, basically, so if it returns true, then it is assumed that is known is true. But if it returns false, then you can check is known for.
So what do you pass in? Basically the question mark?
No. So you would pass in is supported, is dynamic code supported, and then you would have an overload that returns an out bool is known. So if the API is supported, both are true. If it returns false, then is known tells you whether or not that version of the runtime understands the API.
That's not bad, actually.
Tells you if it hit a case label or if it hit default.
Yeah, and then 2.1 will still always return false, but 3.0 and forward, people can check, does the runtime understand the thing that you're querying for?
And technically speaking, our support thing says the moment that we have released a dot release, we no longer support the previous dot releases of that version.
And
So we don't support 2.0 or 2.1.0. If we bug fix this, we only support the version that has the bug fix.
but then we also don't have to worry about what does not mean for every single API. We just have to be like, does this runtime understand this flag?
Yeah, so I agree with we should fix the problem going forward. But if 2.1 is the only thing that we actually care about here, we should solve the problem going forward and bug fix
Yeah.
2.1.
I think the problem with the only problem with Jeremy's approach is that you can't prereq it, right? Because you can only require like major or minor.
This is what our support matrix says, that
Yeah.
we only support the latest dot release.
I think if I were a software provider, I would probably just write a platform check at that point. Say like, I don't know whether you guys are fixing 2x, and even if you do, I don't know how I prereq this, so I just write a platform check for that, and then
Yeah,
call it a day.
I think the downside of the platform check is though that as the platform support expands and
No, that's why you use these APIs. There's a platform support extends. They will
only do
support
the
these
platform
properties,
check if it returns false.
right? And so that's why exactly the scope was written. Right? Basically, you say if you don't have the capability APIs, then I light up on the ones that I happen to care about.
Right.
And then the idea is everybody else just goes to this path. Because you would expect that whoever shows up after the fact implements the latest API. I mean, it's not guaranteed, but that's kind of the same way of doing things. Which is why I wouldn't care for new things. That's why I think platform, I mean, I generally don't like platform checks for the reasons as you said. Like if things expand, your branches expand, right? And the other problem is it's not reliable because different platforms have different ways to detect them. So it's also non-uniform, right? So your code looks always like somebody got a PhD in platform detection. Versus these ones are effectively uniform and they always work, they light up. The only downside is, well, it doesn't work for the past. But the past is by definition a fixed set, so it seems, seems fine to me.
The platform check APIs may not work in the past as well, depending on how things expand in the future. So
Yeah.
it wouldn't cover everything anyways.
Yeah.
So I like the is known the best, but I think rather than an explicit method, having
You would basically say is supported with
with an out
Because
parameter.
it
the
avoids the double
string
dip.
feature name, but feature, and then out bool is known or is is known
Is known is understood. Some
is known feature.
some name.
Because then all the implementations just use one
Yeah.
switch. They set the out and return, and then we change the existing API to eat the out parameter off the other.
This way it always works. Yeah.
So
And then you don't have to maintain two different switch statements or anything else. Like everything's just happy.
So you're proposing returning true for I understand. True is I understand this and I support it.
Right.
Return false means I don't understand it or I understand it and it's not supported.
Right.
And then out the parameter which says I did or did not understand this.
Alternatively, we have a convention for this.
Yeah,
we
it's
call
the try.
try get
pattern.
is supported,
Yeah.
or try is supported,
Yeah.
which returns true or false, returns whether or not it understood the question, and outs the whether or not it's supported.
Yeah.
Because that I was going to say this is exactly just dictionary try get value with this key.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but we could say that in this one, what people really or care about more is the if it says false, that probably means, or if it doesn't say yes, I support it, they're probably going to treat and I didn't understand the question and I didn't support it as the same. But in a few cases, they may care.
Yeah.
About it. So we could invert the relationship on this.
Yeah, I think the
Exactly.
inverted relationship definitely makes more sense here because if the result is true, then the other one is implicitly true as well.
Yes.
But in the case that the result is false, which is the case that you care about switching on, the secondary result tells you why it was false.
So who owns the platform check APIs, by the way? Does anybody know?
I'm sure we can find out who checked it in.
Yeah.
Jan, it looks like, was the last person to change it. Yeah, let's say Jan.
Right.
Is it part of the system runtime contract?
Probably is.
As in me. So approved.
All right. So, any objections to what I just wrote? I probably type it, but that's part of my natural charm.
I think that's fine.
All right. So then,
Is this a net standard impact?
it probably is marked as such. The thing is, we should probably find it Well, I guess it's the same issue, right? So let's just comment on this. And let's just drive it back to API needs work.
Yeah, all of the other
Is
ones
this,
are next
if
order.
Jan doesn't have objections, then it goes to approved without needing to come back here?
Well, if he has objections, then we should.
Right,
we
if
should
he
flag
has
it back.
objections,
we
but
should
if he
address it, yeah.
agrees, then
If he agrees, then we should update the proposal to reflect that. Basically reflect my feedback as in like, okay, propose this new API, and then we approve that one, and then somebody implements that one.
But yes, so this type did make it is in net standard 2.1, so we should,
Yeah,
should
we
update
should
it with this better pattern
give it ships some time. Yeah.
so that we don't introduce instant legacy.
All right, so this now comes back to
And technically, we could remove the one without the out. As long as the one with the out is present in net standard 2.1, people can do whatever they want.
all right. So any particular issues that you want to look at, Tanner? You had one.
35560.
All right, 3.
No, 35560.
Okay. Levi, you had one.
I have two. 35530.
355 30.
Yes.
Okay. What's the other one?
34830.
Okay.
34366. No one will have an opinion on.
3, 4.
366.
Wait. Great. I can close this one.
Right, so hopefully this one's easy.
Rejected. That's
Yep.
easy.
For the AVX and AVX2 class, we expose insert vector 128 and extract vector 128. And unlike most of the other APIs, we are currently exposing both forms that take an address and forms that take a vector directly. There's actually no need to expose the address forms. We can just support the address form via containment in the JIT like we do with most of the other hardware intrinsic APIs. So the suggestion is we just remove these to avoid confusion, help make the code more performant, and reduce complexity.
Then the feature hasn't shipped. I don't care. Anybody else has opinions on this? I would just approve it.
It's fine. So the idea is, if you want to extract from a particular address, from an index at a particular address, you get a vector 128 pointer, for instance, immediately deref it, and then pass the deref version into the other overloads.
No. So, for example, if you want to do extract to an address, you would do extract value index, and you would pass the result of that to store.
Okay. Yeah,
And just like for load,
got it.
you just say load vector and then pass that vector to as the value, and
Okay.
the JIT knows to say if this is immediately followed by a store,
Yes,
then just fold it so that it does the efficient encoding.
got it.
Basically, this leaves the only things that actually take an address are the explicit load and store instructions
Okay.
and the broadcast instructions. The broadcast instructions were originally part of this proposal, but we can't actually remove all of them because AVX for float and double only exposed a form that was regmem, and then for AVX2 they exposed the reg version.
Got it.
And then so for consistency, we agreed just keep exposing both forms for all of the broadcasts.
No, I'm just going to ask a devil's advocate question. Since all of the idea of this is just straight hardware instructions, are we now having opinions about which hardware instructions were included from instruction set, or was this a convention or a convenience overload on something?
No, so these aren't convenience overloads. These are actual underlying instructions that are commonly used.
And now somebody has to, instead of one instruction, two instruction, or there's just a different way that still lines up in the one instruction?
It's a different way with the one instruction.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So basically, someone will say store, they'll say AVX store, and inside as the param they'll say AVX extract blah blah blah,
Yeah.
and the JIT will say fold that down to just extract with the memory.
I actually have a PR out that uses that instruction. Thank you, Tanner. I might need to change my PR now. It's fine.
All right, so that means API approved.
Took less than 5.
Yeah. It's deletions. It's great.
It took way longer than it should have for deletion.
Is Eric on the phone?
No.
No. Okay. So what happened here was there was a public API on Rune that was not exposed in the ref assemblies, and during some refactoring in CoreFX recently, it got exposed in the ref assemblies, even though it had never been approved.
Right.
So this is, let's review it. Clearly the name is such that it was never intended for public exposure. But yeah, basically, given a rune, write it out as UTF-8. We already had the UTF-16 overload. It was already implemented. The reason it was never previously approved is because we were waiting for Chori to come online. And we were just going to use an overload of trying code. But at the last review, we said that we're okay with putting things like UTF-8, UTF-16, blah, blah, blah as suffixes on these methods.
Yeah, I think what we said earlier was that for most of our cases, it's obvious from the type,
Yeah.
or from the method name already what's happening. In this case, it seems it would be beneficial to say try and code to UTF-16 in the previous one to just have clarity.
I mean, we can always rename it. Like, it never shipped in 2.1 or 2.2.
When we get char 8, we can have try and code span of char and try and code span of char 8, and the type information tells you what it's encoded. And then this one is because it's taking bytes, it has to tell you what bytes it's writing down. So it seems fine in like a mild wart, but everywhere that we're doing UTF-8.
So, sorry, are you suggesting that we leave try and code without the suffix because we can add the overload later, or do you suggest to rename try and code
So
to try and code to UTF-16?
The first one's already there in the ref assembly today. The second one is the one that has never previously been released in any preview.
Right.
The second one, we would definitely want to have UTF-8 somewhere in the name,
Right.
if it's a span of byte as a parameter.
Because
Right.
I don't think that we would. Either we rename the. So there's going to be a third thing. Let's call it next release.
Right.
So we get char 8 online of whatever it's called. So we either have 2 try encodes, which are span of char and span of char 8, or the current one, we make a breaking change to rename, breaking from 3.0 preview, to rename try encode to UTF-16.
Right.
And then we have 2 overloads of try encode to UTF-8, which is span of byte and span of char 8.
Yeah.
Granted, we could also add try encode to UTF-16 span of byte because
We could, if we wanted to.
And so it's a question of where do we want where are we getting the type inference of overload resolution, and where are we getting the good name? So I think that try encode is fine for we have a span of a rich type that's conveying this. The span of byte one is the one that's not conveying information, so it breaks the overload.
So you are suggesting leaving the previous one as is then, and then later on potentially add the overload.
I think it's fine.
Yeah, I mean that's a reasonable approach.
Again, if we were getting char 8 this release, we would have just 2 try encodes, right, and we wouldn't have anything with byte in it.
And that is why we never approved this API in the previous review.
Right, because we couldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we wanted the overloads.
So this is
that works for me.
if we deferred Rune until we had char 8, then we would not have one that had the word UTF-8 in the name.
Yeah.
So let's just say this method's being added early, so it's
So
splitting the condition.
try and code as UTF-8 then, instead of 2 UTF-8 bytes.
What is UTF-8?
Because then, if we wanted to, the other methods that wrote to bytes would be try and code as UTF-16 big Indian, little Indian, UTF-32 big Indian, little Indian. So there would be 5. If we took this to its logical extreme, there would be 5 methods that had the try and code as pattern.
Well,
Assuming that they
compress the
also expand
UTF-16 with a Boolean parameter if you want to dig into it a little bit.
Sure, yeah, that would work.
I think I like the name just try and code as UTF-8.
Okay.
I think that is slightly better. I agree.
Steve?
Steve was no longer on the call, unfortunately.
Hi, Steve.
We only hit a better call. Alright, so it said try encode as UTF-8, and then we strip the bytes because
It takes bytes as a parameter. Why duplicate the name in the method?
Yeah, and I don't think we're ever going to have like try and code to UTF-8 string or to UTF-8 short.
The feature branch implementation of this type has a to UTF-8 string method on it, which just returns a UTF-8 string.
That's not in code.
Right, right. It fabricates a brand new type and then returns it to you, or a new instance. And there are some comments in the thread too about when it returns true and false and blah blah blah.
Right, which is the Java pattern, right? So
one other thing, there is, and I didn't really call it out here, unfortunately. There are two properties hanging off of the rune type right now: UTF-8 sequence length and UTF-16 sequence length, that tell you the number of code units in UTF-8 and UTF-16 respectively. Do we like those names, since this is our opportunity to rename them if we need to?
It seems, because the other, like, if we wanted them to look closer in IntelliSense, it would be like length, code unit length UTF-16, which just feels awkward. So as a property, I think it's fine, UTF-8 code unit length and UTF-16.
Well, they are called right now UTF-8 sequence length and UTF-16 sequence length. Like, we could remove the word sequence, we could replace it with code unit. Like, we could just no-op, not do anything, just say, you know what, it's fine as
is.
is.
Sequence a term from the spec?
Kind of.
Unless you're arguing that you want to rename the thing that you yourself brought.
No, it's the spec does use sequence just in terms of, like, it is all strings are sequences of code units.
Yeah.
Like,
So I will say, and I know we haven't been very consistent with this with any of the stuff with Java Span. Do we want to have the non-try versions of this? Because technically our try guidance says if you have a try, you should have a non-try. And in this case, there is a property telling you exactly how long. So you could test it, or you could simply do the assert. Like, there are possibly some places that I'm going to want to try and do some late 3.0 editions of where we've added try API for crypto, and all that I do, literally everywhere I call it, is if not try, or it returns the wrong output.
Yeah.
Or like fail, or throw an exception. It's like, wait, why am I not just calling do this?
I mean, we could. I have no qualms with having an actual encode method.
And then in code, technically, there's two different possible overloads we have. One is it outs the length, and the other one is it throws if the input was not the exact right length.
So I actually have that API. It's internal.
Right, and so this is the, like, while thinking of what I wanted with hashcode.compute, or try compute hash writing it with span, is, well, with this one I know you better write, this number of bytes. If you didn't, something's wrong, so I'm going to throw, so why doesn't the API just do this for me?
I mean, if it follows the conventions that we've set out everywhere else, we may as well.
Right. The problem is with span, so far with span, our rule is ignore the rule that says add a non-try overload. Or add a non-try variant. And that's because really when we started doing span, we changed what try meant off of the try parse pattern, so technically we're in new territory, but this is part of trying to codify what we think the rules should be going forward.
Okay. It's a really easy change to add that.
So, because of the way Emo approved it and asked a question, you would have to propose that as new API. Or just decide that it's grandfathered in under Emo's question. I'm fine with either.
Right.
So going back to the
And Emo's rolling his eyes.
I don't care. UTF-8 sequence length or UTF-8 sequence length. The only thing I would suggest is can we have a common prefix rather than a common suffix?
Yeah, but I feel that like the Englishy flow, like the noun that you're asking over is UTF-8, and as a property, putting the UTF-8 on the end just looks wrong in my head.
It's kind of like long length versus.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
that's also not a great API, by the way.
No, it's
yeah.
not.
But I think that the APIs are named
Adequately.
Yes.
Not happily, but adequately.
correctly.
Correctly, okay.
Yeah, my care level is not super high. It's just, I don't know. It seems a bit on the long side for sure. And it also seems a bit more convoluted than it needs to be, probably.
Okay.
But I also don't have a great alternative suggestion.
Okay.
All right, so then
Let's go to Jeremy's first.
Do you support on the other one? Do you want to form a bone? Is that what you're trying to do?
No, I think this will just be less contentious, and I'd like to get something done.
Okay,
Have 50
so
minutes.
RSA encryption. There's a variation. There's two forms of RSA encryption. One's called PKCS, which is the classic thing. One's called OAEP, which is the new thing. And instead of making a new algorithm, what RSA did is they added it as an option, and so then we in our classes added it as an option, and so there's this whole plumbing problem. So what this is saying is for our envelope CMS type, there's no way that you can indicate with our type right now that you want to use the newer form of encryption padding. So this is just adding an overload that when you pass in a certificate, you can pass in the padding mode. It'll throw if it's not RSA, and then you can also, there's an overload where you can specify the subject type, and then, so he added both overloads, and then the nullable property to indicate, so it will return null if you didn't call one of these overloads, otherwise it'll return the value.
Sorry, say again, why wouldn't you just assume a very particular algorithm? Doesn't it default to PKCS?
It defaults to PKCS. The problem is SDL says use OAP, but you don't know if your recipient supports it. So this
Okay,
is,
got it.
as the person saying I'm encrypting this, you can say I want to use OAP. So this is the old API has to do what the old API does. This new API lets you do the new secure standard.
Got it.
The padding already exists.
RSA encryption padding is a type that has existed for all of that, I think. Plus about a week.
Can be nullable though, because it's already a class.
Hmm?
You can't make the property nullable because it's already a class.
RSA
Hold on.
encryption padding is
It's an enum, isn't it?
it's a
Nope, it's a class.
no. If it's a class, then
It's just no.
Okay then.
I thought it was a struct.
See?
Yeah.
This is what you gain from times, but it doesn't matter. Like, the
Apparently
intent
that's-
is the same. Like
Oh, it's a magic string class thing.
it's a magic string class, yes.
Oh no, well it's because it's a one pole or two pole. Because it's
Yes.
the
Because the hash
padding
algorithm
mode
makes
is
it
the
no too.
enum, and then the hash algorithm is a magic string.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a dumple. That's what it is.
Okay, so it's remove the question mark because it's already a reference type.
Is it going to be surprising to people if this property might return null?
They gave null as the input, null is what they get as the output.
Well, strictly speaking, though, you can put the question mark moving forward, right? So I can leave it as it.
Maybe that's what he meant it as.
Yeah, maybe that's. what it is.
And then I'm just doing one check right now to see if any other properties on this thing are get set, or if they're all just get.
See? You're using the new features. All right.
They're all get only. So you pass it to the constructor, and then you get. Right? Cool. See, I didn't know I might have an opinion.
Right.
Because it says cryptography.
We had opinions, we just had very loosely held opinions.
Apparently, you had the opinion that this type's a class. But that's not an opinion, it's fact. So...
I have the best opinions. My opinions are fact.
Okay. So this is needed for some of the JSON serializer work that's being done. We currently have ways to escape HTML URIs and JavaScript strings in the framework. those mechanisms all accept UTF-16 data. Because we have things like UTF-8 JSON serializers, it would be great if we had mechanisms that accepted UTF-8 data. There are two proposals here. One is adding a brand new set of types to do UTF-8 and UTF-8 only, and they would exist side by side with the UTF-16 types, but nary the two shall meet. The second proposal is actually adding UTF-8 overloads to all of the existing UTF-16. The plus side to the first proposal is it doesn't come with any of the legacy or cruft or anything else that is afflicting the original types. The problem with it is you now have effectively duplication of, I don't want to say logic, but like you effectively have duplication throughout the framework now. One does UTF-16, one does UTF-8. And if you're in ASP.NET and you're customizing it, saying, hey, I want to put a new encoder in for the DI system, now you have to specify both, not just one. The plus side to the second proposal is that solves the ASP.NET problem. Just say, this is the encoder that you're going to use. You only have to mention it once. And the downside to that is it makes the API shape a bit weird. So, yep. This again is the first proposal looking at here. This was written in terms of char 8. It could be written in terms of byte because it's explicitly UTF-8 in the type name, so I don't really care.
So this is, I think we looked at this earlier, right?
We did, yes.
So remind me again what the problem was with the existing types. It's basically the way they're going over the API. It's similar to Stream, right? Where the actual abstract methods are not the ones you want to expose or something to that extent, right?
Basically, all of the abstract methods are written in terms of UTF-16, which again is totally fine, because if you haven't, say that we add UTF-8 methods to the UTF-16 class, what we would do is we would just say, if you haven't overridden the UTF-8 methods, we use the UTF-16 ones as the source of truth, and we just always transcode each way under the covers. Like, it works totally fine, and that's actually how...
So what's the existing type name again?
Existing type name is text encoder in the namespace system text encodings web.
And that one is UTF-16,
Correct.
clearly because it takes string, text writer, and yeah. Then there's find first character to encode, which takes the char pointer, and then from there on it's like, yeah, I see.
So that's one of the other interesting things about these types. You'll notice that there are three methods which you have to which are marked as abstract. So if you want to subclass this, you absolutely must override these methods. 2 of them are unsafe, and all 3 of them are marked as editor browsable never.
So it's great.
Yeah, so in practice, no one ever subclasses these types.
Change of abstract.
Yes.
Mostly what happens.
Yeah.
You're proposing this in UTF-8 and texting folder. So like, how does? But you're only proposing this one, right? You don't propose a UTF-16 text encoder.
Because the original text encoder is UTF-16.
So are you basically saying that if you want UTF-16, use text encoder. If you use UTF-8, use UTF-8 text encoder?
Yeah, and we basically don't touch the original types. They stay as is. So there are also subclass types: HTML encoder, JavaScript encoder, URI encoder, URL encoder.
And that's similar to
there
the
will be
existing
analogs.
pattern? Is that fair?
Sorry?
Is that mirroring the other pattern that we
Yes,
have for the
it mirrors it
UTF-16?
exactly, yes.
Encoder, JavaScript
And then just so the alternative is editing the existing class, adding virtuals that are fine. I'll call the UTF-16 one, and then I'll re-encode this
Yes,
so that we can make it work.
yes.
But is anybody? So you mentioned that probably in practice, very few people are deriving from these.
Right.
So theoretically, if we just fixed the 4 of these, we've solved 9 nines of versus 5.
Yes,
And the new virtuals would not ever get used.
correct.
sort of seems. I guess the problem is that when you're deriving it, we're creating the same problem, or we're creating the same problems that we've done in the stream every time we've upgraded it. But there's another thing that you're supposed to override that the language can't help you, and you're supposed to override. But if no one's ever overriding it now, I don't know.
Yeah, I looked in APIs of .NET, and the usage of this was I didn't see any usage whatsoever of anyone overriding this.
And it's always sad if your core extension API is basically unsafe code, right? It's
Yeah. Like, I think what I did is I looked at the constructor of each of these types and saw zero usage. The protected constructors.
No, I think that's a way better proposal than the original one. Because originally you proposed to like break the type entirely and just like do something else with it, right? Delete some methods, add new methods or something, right?
Yeah.
And then I think this one is the closest we get to without complete duplication and without breaking people, which seems
Yeah.
like a
So you still have the original proposal on the screen, like the one that actually adds whole new types. If you scroll down halfway through the
let
page,
me just get my
that's
mouse.
the proposal that their alternative. This is the one that adds APIs to the existing type and doesn't break anything as far as I'm aware. It does obsolete some properties and some methods.
So the benefit with this is that people don't have to know what the encoding is, correct?
Well, you never have to know per se. Well, what do you mean?
Well,
what the encoding is?
so the proposal that you currently have basically splits this hierarchy into two hierarchies, right? There's UTF-16 one and there's UTF-8 one.
Yeah.
So when you exchange a type, you have to make a decision what the underlying encoding is. So basically, your APIs manifest the encoding that you're writing to, right? Versus the other one, you have an actual abstraction text encoder, and you don't care whether you write to UTF-16 or UTF-8. There's only one type to choose, right?
In terms of choosing an encoder?
In terms of like you accept an encoder, you write to that encoder, and then whether the underlying thing ends up being UTF-8 in JavaScript or UTF-16 in URL, you don't care, right?
So
you're complete agnostic to that.
Yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, it prevents you from having to worry about UTF-8 versus UTF-16. You just write to the encoder and both APIs are there. The intent of these APIs was not to abstract away, I'm doing HTML, URL, JavaScript. Like, the caller absolutely has to know which of the three it's writing to. And in fact, the original implementations of all of these encoders did not have a shared abstract class.
But it means that the original, or that the caller has to choose, I'm doing HTML, JavaScript, URL.
Yes.
But they don't need to care that the output is UTF-8 or
Yes.
UTF-Y.
Yes.
The only
They're choosing
yeah.
one person can choose the semantic notion, and another person can choose the binary encoding.
Yes.
So I have a general preference to amending the existing types instead of creating an entire parallel hierarchy that has UTF.
Yeah.
The only question that I have is how many places are we going to have to add the word byte when we meant the word char8, or do we not?
That's the other thing. If we start adding byte overloads, like, we absolutely have to start putting UTF-8 somewhere in these method names.
I mean, other
so,
places that
yeah.
we've done is we've just put UTF-8 in the parameter.
I don't think that's intuitive, though, in things like IntelliSense. There are some things that change here. For instance, the max output characters per input character, it's the very first property shown here, goes from abstract to virtual, returns 0, and becomes obsolete. So, yeah.
So what is the customer doing with these types? They just pass them in, right? They don't actually call any methods, right?
The customer, if you're configuring ASP.NET, what you're doing is you're calling one of the existing static factories on these types. That code does not change. The line of code that you write does not change from what it is today.
So what is the factory?
There are create methods on HTML encoder, URL encoder, and JavaScript string encoder. They're not shown here because they're already existing methods on the subclass types. But you would call, if you wanted to customize how ASP.NET works, you call one of the static factories today, just as you did yesterday, just as you did last year. Nothing there's changing. What is changing is if you wanted to subclass the type, which I have no evidence anyone on the planet does,
Right.
the way that you subclass it changes. For instance, this property, which you were previously required to subclass, or which you were previously required to override because it's abstract, even though it's marked editor browsable never, goes from abstract to virtual and becomes obsolete. Stuff like that, because the property just returns a lie to you. Because I can't give you an answer. Like,
Understand. One,
yes,
technically it says max output character or input character.
yes.
Means that it's talking about something, either a surrogate or a basic multilingual plain.
It's talking about a system char. It's talking about a UTF-16 code unit, but no one uses the property internally.
What?
And because it was editor browsable never, no one uses the property externally either. So there's no point to even having it. Like, if honestly, I would just delete the property, but that's a breaking change. Even though, again, APIs of .NET shows that nobody on Earth uses it.
Yeah, like I think I said this last time. Like I think if we motivate this properly, it seems like something that we may get away in 3.0, right? If we basically say, look, there's no usage, the thing is just plain wrong, should have never been shipped. We shipped it, unfortunately.
It was originally intended to be an implementation detail of the
Yeah.
original encoders, which is why it never returned the correct value anyway publicly.
So the one problem with deleting it would be if somebody has extended it, they'll now have an override to a method that the type finder can't find.
Yes.
Right.
And so then
No, I
they're-
mean, it's a breaking change, right? All I'm saying is that it's for all intents and purposes, we know nobody derives from them, nobody uses them.
Yeah.
Like, at that point, it's like, well, how much more data do you want to motivate a breaking change, right? Like, I mean, to like mitigate the impact of a breaking change, right? If for all we know nobody does that,
Yeah.
then the question is, okay, what's the benefit of not having the thing? Well, the same API, I guess,
Right.
is the way to do it.
Which is why this is, I thought, the least impactful thing, where we leave it editor browsable never, we go from abstract to virtual, we return 0, and we just obsolete it, saying, don't call me, don't override me, pretend I'm not here.
Which I think is also, I mean, the message might need some tweaking, but
Sure.
maybe obviously true.
maybe we should add in a pie emoji in there somewhere. The pie is a lie.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with delete.
Like, I think the only thing is we need to go through the motions. I don't think we have, like, did we have files for any yet? I don't think we do.
File for anyone.
For any behavior breaking changes, for example, for 3.0. I don't even know
Not that I'm aware of.
what the process is.
I wouldn't be involved in this.
I would be interested in like doing it to just see like whether we can actually get away with it.
So I do actually, I take that back. I do have a proposed breaking change coming up through the ASCII encoding class. But the feature area owners have said that they don't anticipate anybody relies on that behavior, and they were willing to say, yes, this is an acceptable change. I don't know what the process is, aside from just getting the feature owners to agree that it's acceptable.
Right. So, okay, let's just dial this back then. So there's two discussions here, right? I mean, like, minimum, we just ship the API, hide it, and tell people not to use it.
For sanity
There's
reasons, we change these words abstract to virtual.
Yeah, there's a cleanliness argument for we could go the extra mile and just make it clean. So, assuming we do this, is there anything else you want to get rid of? Like, what about this guy here? Probably same story, right?
So that method, because it takes a pointer, I want to get rid of it. Like, none of these methods should take pointers, especially the ones that are abstract, because it means subclass types have to fall back to unsafe code,
Right.
just in order to subclass this, which is not a good way to be in. I would love to rewrite these in terms of spam.
So there will also be virtual, right? Because they're currently abstract with body.
Yeah,
Yeah,
So
he got it right on the first one and messed
Yeah.
up the rest.
yeah, sorry.
No worries.
yeah, so that makes sense. And then basically you would
Copy
say,
paste, yeah.
So now the question. So if we were going to say, just discussing, if we were going to make a breaking change by removing these abstracts, would we also make the same class breaking change of adding the new things as abstract?
The new UTF-8 stuff? You mean?
Yeah.
I wouldn't make it abstract because it's not strictly necessary. We could always, under the covers, do the work to transcode back and forth.
I mean, just like if we think that it would always be a bad idea, then we could say that somebody has to, if they want to just write the transcode, then do that themselves.
Sure.
But that really what they should be doing is writing the direct encoding while they're doing it.
So,
Well, so I would say if the argument is we are okay with removing abstract members, which means it definitely will break everybody whoever derived from this type. You might as well add new abstract members at that point, right? Because you basically have to touch that code regardless.
This is essentially if our guidance on these is there is a base implementation, you are highly recommended to always overwrite it.
Yeah.
Then let's just say there's not a base implementation, you are required to provide your own because we're going to do it in all our types.
sure.
So if we think that no one has derived this other than us, then we should.
Yeah.
If we're going to delete the abstracts, I think we should introduce the new things.
Okay.
To indicate these are things you're supposed to overwrite. There's an easy implementation. You can even make it a protected static of like transient. But like,
So if we had to redo the entire type from scratch, there are only two methods total which are absolutely required to be abstract. The first is, do I need to encode this particular rune? And the second is, how do you encode it? Like, everything else in the world can be built on top of those two methods. Everything. Right now, the existing type before any of these proposals has 4 abstract methods, which means the existing type is already more complicated than it has to be.
And to be clear, when you originally wrote the type, there was no span, well, there was no rune.
Correct.
And so now we would say we would express it as what, span of rune, I suppose?
It would be
Not really span of rune, right?
the
Span of whatever you're writing.
the protected virtuals would be exposed in terms of rune or int or whatever. It doesn't really matter.
Right.
And the public API surface is exposed in terms of span.
So that would make sense. And then I think this is an area where I think we should probably go with that. Like I think originally when you proposed it, I said, can we see it and propose it as non-breaking first before we?
Yeah,
vote
this
on
is
that
what it
part?
looks like to be non-breaking.
But I think that we understand what the thing does. So like, do we all agree at least that having one type will be better than having 2 types, or is there any benefit of having 2 types? Because it seems like you're basically losing the ability to be a bit independent, right?
There are benefits to having one type. Like I did kind of reverse my position on this over the past few months. It's just easier. It's easier to configure. It's easier to consume. It's easier to subclass. Easier to reason about.
I'd also, I dislike the notion that we take everything in the framework that exists that deals with the concept of text, and then we add a UTF-8 in front of every single one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And so I think that we need that starting to get out of that pattern would be good.
Yeah.
And so fixing this so that it can work for UTF-8 and UTF-16 and then all the various other encoding stuffs. Clearly, your abstract. How do I have this rune? How do I write it down? Unless you're doing rune into a series of runes, you would need to somewhere convey if someone what kind of encoding is someone asking about this, which means that now we have a how do you talk about a particular encoding type,
Right.
But yeah, I would definitely like to see the proliferation of UTF-8 specific types go away.
Yeah.
Especially given that you have to use unsafe to derive from this at all. And our telemetry says we've not seen anybody do it. So I would say that this type can just be rewritten, and maybe we'll find out that was a bad idea.
Yeah.
But it is a major version. Therefore, we are allowed to introduce a breaking change, and therefore, I really, really want to.
If we were to introduce breaking changes, just even in an experimental fashion, this might not be the worst candidate to do so, just because of how few people we suspect subclass it. I have seen. I shouldn't say no one in the world subclasses this. I've seen one place in all of my searching where I've seen someone subclass this, and that's an ASP.NET unit test.
So nowhere.
And the unit test could obviously be changed to match the new pattern.
It also sounds like for this breaking change, if we took it, there wouldn't be any implicit breaks that show up to the user.
Correct. From the only breaks are to people who subclass it,
Right.
assuming that we make all of the abstract methods change. The entire public API surface exposed to external callers, completely identical, unchanged.
Right, and for the people that do subclass it, if they exist, it's not a case of we are silently introducing a breaking change to them. It will be up and in their face.
Yes.
Well, I mean, these abstracts were all public abstracts.
But they're all editor browsable never.
Does that mean they don't show up on MSDN?
They probably do.
Yeah, I think my biggest concern with breaking change is always, are we doing a breaking change that is silent to the user? So they'll end up like recompiling their code and never see that the break exists.
Yeah, they show up on MSDN.
I'm aware MSDN called docs.microsoft.
MSDN. It's still MSDN to me, damn it.
Yeah, Ben is asking whether we should just have UTF-16, UTF-8, but I think we answered that we don't want to force the consumer or either consumer or producer, I guess, of APIs that accepts one of those guys to already choose the encoding.
So when you were talking about accepting a text encoder like as an abstract base class, if I am the JSON serializer, for instance, the idea behind a lot of this is in the JSON serializer settings, like we would put as a property that you can set a JavaScript encoder. Like you can actually set that property and move on. But we would take it explicitly as JavaScript encoder, not text encoder, because we want to signal to the user like, no, you're doing JavaScript string encoding.
Right.
The text encoder base class, the only reason it exists is that a lot of these types have a similar API shape, but beyond that, nobody should ever be using the base class. Nobody should be referencing it. Nobody should be subclassing it. Should always be doing it to one of the derived types.
That's fair. I think this is the thing you said earlier about that, the semantics are important, but I think the question is still like, is the encoding to the bitness, like is UTF-16 versus UTF-8 the important? We basically want to avoid that you have two dimensions of the types to choose, right? The semantic on one axis and then the physical representation on the other one.
Yeah.
And it seems we want to not do that. So then let's do the following. Let's give me a write-up of the motivation that you have. I think it a little bit more internally as well, that we can just take to ship room and see what the thought is. Probably they will probably ask me what our bar for API breaking changes is, and I would say, well, in this case, the motivation is there. The usage is basically non-existent, so it seems fine. Like if you ever want to do a breaking change, I mean that's as clear as they come. I mean,
so I'll follow up with you offline then, and we can just figure out what needs to go into that email.
Right.
Okay, sounds good.
And let me just mark this guy as API needs work, but that's basically we said like it's the
we know what work needs to be done,
exactly.
Which puts us in a better position than last time.
So then when it comes back, it would be what's the
Yep. All right, so now we went through more issues. That's amazing.
Yeah,
and we still have time left. I can't believe it.
That only took half an hour.
Cool. So let me just bring this on the screen, and then we can just collectively decide what we want to do.
So I actually have a issue that we previously reviewed that I ended up having a couple questions on after we approved it, that it might be good to just clarify on.
There's also this breaking change to unsafe unbox.
This one here?
Yeah. No, this is 34881. I've not updated it to be.
If it's not in the list, I can literally open it because I only put it on
Go with the unsafe unbox in the middle. Down.
This one? Okay.
I am torn on this.
I'll update the issue that way.
That's so... You want a box of tea?
No, I don't want to introduce this class. I'm just saying if you introduce it in your own code, it's a way to work around it.
Oh, I see. Okay, so then what are you proposing?
What's in the title?
Return ref read only, not ref t.
So the unbox instruction in IL returns what's called a controlled mutability reference, which we don't have a way of representing in C#. The closest way to represent it is a ref read only t, not a ref t, but it's still not an exact way to represent it. The reason for this is the original motivation of the unsafe unbox API was to unbox an int, mutate it, and then send the newly mutated boxed int somewhere else for processing by like a toString or something API. The thing is, like the runtime says thou shalt not do that because boxed ints really are supposed to be immutable. There are alternative proposals or alternative scenarios where I have a boxed my struct, and my struct is absolutely intended to be mutable. So you should be able to mutate the thing that's within the boxed object. And that could be a reason why you might want unbox to return a ref t instead of ref read only t. But that wasn't the original motivation behind the API being reviewed.
And it's probably worth pointing out further down that it's actually, although the code's not very common, it's entirely valid to have a mutable box,
Yes.
which makes this more confusing.
Yes. Basically, what you want is if t is marked read-only, then you'll want the unbox to return ref read-only t. If t is not marked read-only, you'll want the unbox to return ref t. Like that's the closest thing to what we actually want.
Right. Well, to be fair, though, you don't even have to define it struct, right? You could just use the strong box one we already have, right? If you really wanted to.
Sure.
But I think the question is, but that will be a break. It just dropped out of the call apparently because why not?
I believe this is when they dim the lights. The 5 minutes remaining intermission.
This is why I don't want to be an astronaut. It's like, you're halfway through the moon and then you get this update prompt that says you have 5 minutes and then we'll reboot your machine.
Yes.
Or you're actually just thinking, whatever.
It just explodes, yeah. So if you say that, so unsafe.unbox is already shipped, no?
Not in 2.1. It's new for 3.0.
The reason I'm saying it's shipped is, and that could be wrong, like it shows up for 3.0, but it also shows up as .NET Core plus platform extensions in system.runtime.compiler-service.unsafe. Did we ship a NuGet package?
Unsafe does ship as a NuGet package, yeah.
I thought
this wouldn't have.
I think we also just moved it in box.
Yes, we did.
It was available out of band before, so it would be a break and change to the out of band version.
No, I don't think this ever shipped in any supported version.
Yeah,
this was a very recent
If
API.
if the NuGet package was still only available as a preview package, would you have ingested it?
Well, it shows up as .NET Core platform extensions, which is always manual. So maybe.
Yeah. So,
Sure. Well, if click on 307.3.0 and we can see when it was introduced.
yeah, I don't think the API is shipped yet, but it is.
It's
The
seen.
unsafe class is now
So
in box.
the issue to add this API was opened end of June 2018.
What was it? Unbox. So it's not on NuGet, I can tell you that.
Right.
So the package is on NuGet, but the package that is on NuGet doesn't have the API.
No.
In which case, it's an
Right.
unshipped API.
Right.
So
So I'm of like different minds here because on one hand it's on the unsafe class, like it's unsafe, but on the other hand the unsafe class isn't supposed to be a place where we put things that encourage you to like destabilize the runtime. For instance, like we're never.
The unsafe class exposes IL operations, which is all this is doing.
right.
Yes, but it's returning the wrong type, though. That's the problem. Like, what we really want is to return a controlled mutability reference, which we can't really do in C#, unfortunately.
It's not returning the wrong type, though. It's returning exactly what the IL operation exposes.
The IL operation. You're right. But if you read through the ECMA spec, it says that the only safe way to do this, and by safe I mean like will not destabilize the runtime, is to expose it as a controlled mutability reference. Like we can't just take a boxed int, mutate it, and then expect things will just work. Like that could destabilize the runtime.
It will not destabilize Core CLR.
In the current implementation of Core CLR, correct, but for 3.1 we can't make that same guarantee. For 4.0 we can't make that same guarantee.
I hear you. You're saying we might make a change that would break that. At the same time, if we don't do this, if we don't expose it, people will just use their own NuGet package that already exists out there, which does exactly this.
Yes, but that's okay because it's not us shipping it as a blessed API.
But we already shipped the IL as a blessed API.
Not for this, did we?
No, the IL is there. Anyone can write IL.
Yes. But if you write that IL directly, like if you write that IL, then you have read the ECMA specification, which said thou shalt not do this unless you're willing to take these things as consequences, right?
Well, Stephen, let me ask you a different question. So, are you opposed to marking it as read-only, or are you just playing devil's advocate of saying, why do we care to enforce something that may not be relevant for everybody?
I think we're jumping through hoops to shield people from something that we don't need to shield them from.
But is
It's
there any
unsafe.
technical downside to mark something as ref read-only? I mean, the worst that can happen is you have to cast away the read-onlyness with another unsafe
No,
API.
the other thing that happens with ref read only is it is very easy to introduce an accidental copy based on the C# semantics, which is if you end up invoking any method, etc., on that type, and that type itself is not read only,
Right.
then it creates a hidden copy, then does the operation, throws away the copy, and then gives you back the original value.
I do also want to stress that like the original code sample we were given when we approved the original API is such that it could destabilize the runtime. Again, not
It will
on
not
3.0.
stabilize the runtime.
It can though. Like there's nothing stopping the runtime from saying a boxed instance of a read-only T is itself a singleton. The
I
runtime
think
can
there
absolutely
is.
do that.
You cannot do that for arbitrary Ts.
For read-only T, you absolutely can. Like int
You
and
cannot.
ushort.
But the T could absolutely mutate itself.
Not if it's marked read-only.
Sure, it can.
Using unsafe code, yes.
No,
Yes.
even using safe code. So McGravel gave in 30730 gave an example of just using console.writeLine on a struct foo that has toString incrementing the value and how you can cause it to mutate the box value.
And the
itself.
struct itself is marked read-only.
No. Okay, so
Yeah.
not in the case where the struct itself is marked
Like,
read-only.
When I say when the struct is read-only, I'm talking about like int or as in the original sample ushort, stuff like that. Like if the struct itself is not marked read-only, yeah, it's mutable. Have fun. Like you can mutate a box struct. Like
Sure. Like, I think, so, to me, the argument would be, if we were to ship the API, I think we want to expose effectively what the thing does, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know whether read-only ref or ref read-only sorry, ref versus ref read-only is the closer thing from IL. But the thing is that the general spirit of the unsafe thing has been that, well, if you call any of these APIs, you better know what you're doing, right? Like none of these APIs are designed to be, well, you just call the API, and if it doesn't require you to put unsafe in C#, you're fine, right? It still means you can more or less violate arbitrary constraints that somebody might have, and so
Yes.
you need to be mindful of that. I think Jan's position in general has always been that he doesn't like this thing in the middle of like, well, you're kind of guarded, but at some point you fall off the cliff.
right.
Like you're either guarded or you're not guarded. I find this, on the one hand side, it's appealing because it's very simple messaging. On the other hand, I think it's a bit throwing out the baby with the bathwater at times, where it's like, well, you can avoid easy mistakes. But I think if what Tanner says is true, then I would also say, well, you trade one class of easy mistakes with another class of easy mistakes, right? It's like, well, are you no better off with this thing being marked read-only or not, right? Like,
The read-only issue is going to be slightly better in C# 8 because so in C# 7 you can only mark an entire struct as read-only, and so
Right.
you have the issue with partially mutable structs. Even when the struct is read-only, you can have a field which is itself not read-only and therefore can cause copies. But C# 8 is adding read-only method, so you can explicitly say a method no longer mutates, which will help in some of the cases to avoid those hidden copies.
well, if people put this all over the place, right? That's the,
Right.
which I'm doubtful, but
Right. So I guess my opinion on it would be if something in making it be ref T if the way that we're layering something is we're violating what's supposed to be an invariant, then we should fix that. If we're not violating an invariant, then
So
whatever.
what the runtime spec says here is it's a controlled mutability managed pointer, which means the type decides whether the value can be mutated. And there's nothing at the IL level that allows you to specify whether or not the type allows the thing to be mutated.
The
It's implicit knowledge of this type is mutable, even if it's marked immutable or etc.
Right. The closest thing we have is a declarative read-only keyword, but it's still not an exact match.
Right.
And so I agree the safer thing would be to say it returns ref read only, and if you do decide it's mutable,
You
just
cast it
yeah.
away.
just cast it
And,
away.
and this is why I am of two minds on this, right? Like, it's on the unsafe class. Like, you're doing something that is clearly unsafe, but on the other hand, like, I don't want an API that encourages people to do things that other parts of the runtime might be relying on you not doing.
If I understand correctly, by giving you the ref key, this means if you have a box of 5,
Yeah.
you can, without making a new box, replace the box as being a box wrapping a 7.
Yes.
And you reference equals against the same box, but the value that comes out wasn't the value that went in.
Correct. The reference equal will be identical.
And
Yep.
Which is no different than having a class, like a strong box
Yeah.
event.
right.
That is correct. Yeah.
So, I mean, and yeah, so if this is literally just the same as writing that IL, which is probably actually what's backing its implementation, then then my official answer is I don't have it.
If we wanted to keep this as ref2, should we just like really strongly document like, hey, you have to be aware of all these crazy things with this very particular API?
Yeah, somebody in the chat said, you're invoking a method on the unsafe type, you have been warned. But at the same time, yeah, it would probably help to say, like, what is the expectation for this particular method? Because otherwise it's like, well, sure, I have to be careful, but what does that translate to, right? So I think linking to the IL spec is also reasonable to say this does this IL instruction, so, you know, there's already a spec written that tells you what you're supposed to do. Like, the problem when you say something like, you know, it may destabilize the runtime, I think what ends up happening in most people's head is like, well, I'll find out if that's the case, and unless that's not the case, I assume everything's fine. And I think, like, if you try to scare people too much, they just start to ignore the warning.
And I do want to, you know, call that out, because I'm not trying to, you know, spread FUD, and Steve is correct. Like, in 3.0, it's not going to destabilize anything. But remember, we agreed earlier this meeting to obsolete string.copy because a future runtime reserves the right to do things like basically automatic string interning via during GC. Like, a future runtime reserves the right to pool boxed instances of read-only Ts. There's no reason a runtime couldn't do that. And if we get people relying on this API, we've now broken a lot of code.
Or we make the API throw versions that we introduce.
But then why would we introduce an API now that might throw in the future?
Every API
So I
that we
think-
introduce might throw in the future.
I hear what you're saying, and at the end of the day, like, I'd rather make it ref read only than remove the API.
Yeah.
But there are a myriad of ways that people can and already are doing the same thing already, whether it's using the IL directly or whether it's doing, you know, the example that Jan has in one of these threads where he just uses unsafe as with a simple class that has a single field of T and, you know, unsafe as dot value.
Yeah.
Like, whether or not this API is there, people are going to be doing this. And if we change the runtime, we will be breaking people. So I don't believe that exposing this API as ref versus ref read only in any way shields us from breaking people.
That seems almost like a defeatist argument, though, in the sense that, well, if other people are already doing things that are going to you know, violate these invariants, we should expose an API that just allows them to do it in a blessed fashion.
No, it's not defeatist. It's realistic. It's saying if we're going to make what's actually a breaking change based on behavior exhibited today versus behavior exhibited tomorrow, then we need to be aware that we are going to be breaking people. And we need to do it with the notion of, well, okay, it's side by side. People won't upgrade and they'll change their code if they need to. So if someone's using unsafe.unbox and they're assigning a value into it and that ends up breaking in the future, well, then they'll have to not do that, regardless of what mechanism they're using to achieve this.
Sure. No, that argument makes sense.
That said,
Yeah,
at the end of the day, I honestly, if we want to add read-only, I think it's sort of, it doesn't matter.
Would the easiest thing just be to make this a doc issue then?
I think that's probably fair. I think, as I said, I think it's generally good on on unsafe to document what the expectation of the API is. I just think anything would be permissible. I think it would be okay to quote that section from the IL. It would be okay to link to it. I mean, I don't think you have to go out of your way to make it idiot proof either. But
this code is also for perf-oriented scenarios, and in the cases where you do want to mutate it, which is probably the common case for this API, having to also insert an unsafe as to split off the read-onliness is going to end up impacting JIT throughput because it's got more IL to process, more calls it has to inline, etc. More locals to deal with.
From the features perspective, string.copy, the problem is if you want to use string.copy to then pin and modify the string, there is a gap between the time that it is returned and the time that you've pinned it, where it could have been deduped and the reference ends up obliterating data.
Yeah.
In this case, if we start changing in the runtime to do collapsed boxing, the runtime understands it just gave a ref to inside the box and it could not collapse this box. It could move that to another DC phase. So one of them, the runtime understands that you have the ref and the other one it doesn't because you have a reference type instead of a value type. So,
okay.
So if the only thing that we're concerned with is pooled boxing later, I think that we would know that we have this API and we would.
Yeah, that is honestly my only concern.
And if we think that we can't do the ref tracking with that feature, we would make this API start throwing, and that's better than having people who are hand rolling it and then they're now violating invariance. So,
okay.
And if
Jeremy, you mean this would if we did start pooling boxes and you used this on a already pooled box, we would throw?
That's one possibility. It's all a question of how much we value that feature versus the safety of this or unsafety of this API, etc. Once you think that you're replacing what's in the box, presumably you think that you're the only one who understands the box, or that you think that you understand everyone who understands the box. If it's a pooled box 5, then how many places in the runtime are you replacing their notion of 5? So that's when it would get dangerous, and that's now just a cost of that feature. I'd say the easiest answer is we just never pool boxes. Because it's really easy to not do features.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the going back to the string.copy thing, I would not be surprised if what we find is we obsolete string.copy and someone says, oh, I'm getting an obsolete warning. What I better do is call string.toCharArray new string. And now the dedupe feature will still dedupe them and they'll still have the exact same problem. It'll just be less efficient.
Well,
people will always come up with,
right,
ways of writing the code they want to write.
And you're right, and we did try to work around that earlier by saying maybe the obsolete message can give you explicit steps on how to do what you're trying to do.
And again, alternatively, we can, we own the runtime that would be deduping the strings. We could make a conscious decision to taint an object that comes back from string.copy to say this one shall not be deduped because someone's being stupid.
Yeah.
And we can do that. We can also make it throw again. But hopefully, if somebody gets an obsolete warning, they at least look at why it says it's obsolete before just writing code to do what they want.
Yeah.
I can't promise that, but that's what I hope to do.
Okay, so doc issue then. So resolve this as I guess not resolve this is won't fix, but just turn it into a Docker shell. Yeah.
If it's already if content's already on the doc site, that means it's a moved bug.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think the one feedback that somebody gave, I think Tornhoof, was saying that we should probably include the span overload string create in the obsolete message rather than the other two things.
Yeah.
But I think that's already covered that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, okay, so we basically concluded that we don't want to do that, right?
I think the conclusion is that the current state better matches what the IL semantics are, and any future problems either is a cost of the future feature that introduces the problems or is on a class that says let's say.
Yeah.
And we should be very explicit in the docs and, be very clear about what issues, what this does, what unsafety it's exposing, and that things in the future could change.
And if we really wanted to, we could also, on a separate, not unsafe type in the future, expose ref read only T, if we wanted to. If you didn't want to mutate, you just wanted to like cheaply unbox.
Well, I mean, then you can just do ref read only T equals unsafe dot.
No, I mean without using the unsafe class. I mean, I don't really have a good scenario for it. It's just something we could do in the future if there's demand.
Oh, is this on a struct? Or the boxed object is large? That you would want the ref to the inside instead of
yeah.
Because for an int, it's like
For an int, it's cheaper than a pointer, so whatever. Yeah. Okay, awesome.
sure.
Yeah, let me just respond to this.
Box. The only way, box.inspect would give you back the read-only ref.
Just get the language to add controlled mutability pointers.
I'd be fine with that.
I mean, they technically have the concept today with ref read only. There's no way to express that in IL.
Yeah.
All right. So what's our current 3.0 count remaining email?
Well, 3.0 count remaining is
I just want to
Okay.
I
understand.
think we got through 6 of them today.
I just want to understand our
more than that.
sort of burn down.
Like 35 of them there, not 15. Yeah, as I told Jeremy yesterday, I'm less concerned about this number. I'm much more concerned about this number here. Yeah.
I was going to say, that's a good number.
Bizarrely, nothing is both ready.
So
and
we have API approved 31, all marked for 3, or like somebody needs to decide whether we do them or not.
I've got like 3 of them on my plate right now that are in PR already.
Yeah, I do too, yeah.
So by the way, who's the customer of this unsafe unbox API?
I think
Steve gave a code sample earlier. It was in the linked bug.
Yeah, I think Steve's the customer.
Which is fine. Like, right, we have customers for it, clearly. Like, that's not under dispute. Steve, are you still on the line?
No, he dropped out.
I've also seen like 3 or 4 people in the Gitter channel ask. There's been people in the Discord channel that have asked, and
the original bug that was filed said it could be used to optimize IP address notation. Steve gave a code sample for how it could be used for that.
I see.
Yeah.
Cool.
So.
All right. So then I think we're done. Thanks, guys, online.